So Gracie and Peter, I got to tell you something, okay? So it just so happened that Superhero Granddad and the Spy Kids were in Maryland, and they were just didn't have that much to do, and the Superhero Granddad was trying to make the kids understand that the first thing they got to do every day is eat a healthy breakfast and avoid the empty calories, and then during the day they got to eat a lot of vegetables, and they can grow strong and smart. But then they were looking at on the TV and reading the newspaper, and they found out that somehow all the macaroni was gone from all over the stores, and there was no macaroni, and people couldn't make macaroni and cheese, and they couldn't make macaroni pie, and a lot of kids were crying, and it was a big mystery, and so they decided that they were going to investigate, and of course, you know, what the first thing they got to do after they have their healthy breakfast is they got to make a plan. So they sat down and they started to think about it. And so as you probably know, a lot of the pasta in the whole world comes from Italy, a little country in Europe, and it's shaped like a boot. And so they said, well, we got to go over to Italy and try to track this thing down and see what's going on, because the really good macaroni is made from a special kind of wheat called durum wheat. So we're going to go over to Italy, and we're going to talk to all the wheat farmers, and we're going to find out what's going on. And that's exactly what they did. So they got in a school bus, and they drove to the coast, and then Superhero Granddad turned the school bus into a submarine, and then they headed off to Italy, and then they landed in Italy, and they started asking around. And so they found out that that's exactly what was going on. The farmers woke up one day and all the wheat was gone from their fields, and so the idea was, well, let's look and see, because they got to have big heavy trucks to get all this wheat out of here. So they followed the tracks of the truck, and it went all across Europe, and then it headed north, and then it headed east, and the tire tracks led them all the way to Afghanistan. And so they said, well, let's see what's going on here, and it took them up into the mountains in Afghanistan, and it was really cold there. But fortunately, Superhero Granddad, you know that he's pretty smart, so he had brought along gloves and winter coats, and of course, you know, for walking in the snow, what we do is, like, we don't go to REI and buy real expensive snowshoes. We put tennis rackets on our feet, and we walked through the snow. So they climbed up the mountain, and they came to this big cave. And so they were going to go into the cave, and then they got a cell phone call from Italy, and they said, "Yikes! You know what else? Not only all the macaroni's gone, but the princess of all of southern Italy is gone. She's not in her castle anymore, and everybody is so sad, and so." Maybe at the same time as you look for the wheat, you could look for the princess of all southern Italy. And so they started to go into the cave, but then they had to stop short because you know what was guarding the cave? This is really strange, but there was 3 dragons guarding the cage, and one of them was breathing fire. And so if they got near, he would burn them with fire. And the other one, he had really cold breath, and he could turn them into ice. So they had to back off. And then the third dragon, and this is the ultimate dragon, he could do both. He could breathe fire, and he could turn them into ice. And they said, well, boy, this is really getting complicated. So we got to go back to the school bus. And so they put it back on their tennis rackets, and they went back to the school bus. And so Superhero Granddad, he knows a lot about chemistry, so he made a paint that he could put on them, and it made them invisible. So they painted on the invisible paint, and then they went back up to the mountain, and they walked right by the dragons. You couldn't see them, and they got deep inside the cave, and sure enough, who do you think they spotted there? Laughing and eating a big bowl of macaroni and cheese. It was the nefarious evil genius, Colonel Sanders, and so they said, "We're going to get you now." And he heard them say that, and so you remember he's got this one gold tooth here, and when he blows through the tooth, it makes this real loud whistle. So he whistled, and the dragons came because he had them trained. And even though the dragons couldn't couldn't see Superhero Granddad and the Spy Kids, they circled around the evil genius, and they protected him. And they're breathing fire, and they're breathing ice, and so Superhero Granddad and the Spy Kids, they had to back off again. So they had to get another plan. So what they decided to do was well, we're going to take care of these dragons, but they're so dangerous. So what we're going to do is we're going to start feeding them just junk food. We're going to take away all their good food, and we're going to feed them junk food. So for weeks and weeks, they only had empty calories, and as a result, the dragons, they got real lazy and sleepy, and they got weak and lethargic. And so then they went back and they said, well, now it's time to attack Colonel Sanders, and we're going to grab him this time. But you know, Colonel Sanders, he's no dummy. He knew this was going on, and so he snuck out the other way to the back of the other side of the mountain, and he was long gone by the time they got back there. And so they said, daggone, this guy, he's pretty smart, and he outfoxed us again. So then they went back into the cave, and they rescued the princess of all southern Italy, and they got all the wheat, and they called up and they got trucks to come, and they loaded all this wheat onto trucks, and they took it back down the mountain and then back to Italy, and then the factory started up and they made more macaroni, so all the stores could have macaroni, so that they could make macaroni pie and everybody could be happy. So then they said, well, okay, well, we're going to go back, and on our way back to Maryland, we're going to drop off the princess of all of southern Italy back into her country. And boy, was she pretty. She had on a really fancy dress and sparkly shoes. And so they got into the submarine, and they went back to Italy. And then they started driving her, and they took her back to southern Italy, and then they headed back to Maryland. And then on the way to Maryland, they were going by this playground, and they heard this little boy crying, going, wah, 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 wah. And so they had to stop, and they had to investigate, well, what's going on? And so they went up to the little boy, and he said, well, why are you crying? And they said, well, those other boys, they won't play with me. They won't share the soccer ball with me, and it makes me very sad. And so Superhero Granddad talked to the other kids, and so he said, look, that you have to be nice, and you have to share, and you have to be nice to everybody, and it's not fair to be a bully and treat this little kid like that. And then so the other kids, they understood. In fact, they started crying. They were so ashamed of themselves, because you have to be nice to everybody. And then the mom of the little boy who had been crying, she came up to Superhero Granddad, and she says, you saved the day, which is exactly what he's constantly doing. So then they all got back into the bus, and then they drove down, and they turned it into a submarine, and they went back to Maryland. And guess what? They lived happily ever after.